The Life of Henry Suso, Part 6. Chapter 38. Of certain devout practices of a young beginner in his early years. Once upon a time the sick spiritual daughter besought the servitor, who had come to see her in her illness, to tell her something about spiritual things, not of too grave a kind, but yet such as a godly soul would hear with pleasure. Upon which he told her about his devout practices in early life, in the following words. As the servitor was in his youth of a lively temperament, he made it a practice for a long time, whenever he was bled, to turn in spirit to God under the cross, and, lifting up his wounded arm, to say with an inward sigh, "Ah, friend of my heart, remember that it is the way with lovers to go to their beloved ones at the time of bloodletting, in order that the new blood may be good. But thou knowest well, dear Lord, that I have no beloved save one thee alone, and therefore I come to thee to bless my wound and to make my blood good." At the same season of his youth, when his face was still in its fresh bloom and beauty of color, it was his practice, as often as he shaved himself, to go to the Lord and say, "Ah, sweet Lord, if my countenance and mouth were as rosy as the hue of all red roses, thy servitor would keep them for thee, and give them to no one else. Though thou lookest only to the heart, and regardest little what is outward, nevertheless, dear Lord, my heart offers thee herein a love token and testimony that it turns to thee, and to none but thee." When he put on a new tunic or cloak, he would first go to his usual place of prayer and beseech the Lord of heaven, who had provided him with his garment, to wish him good luck and happiness in it, and to help him to wear it out in the fulfillment of his all-lovely will. Before this, in his childhood, it had been his custom, when the beautiful summer came and the tender flowerets first began to spring up, never to pluck or touch a flower until he had greeted the gift of his first flowers, his spiritual love, the sweet, blooming, rosy maid, God's mother. When it seemed to him that the time for doing this had come, he picked the flowers with many loving thoughts, and, carrying them to his cell, made a garland of them. And when he went into choir or into Our Lady's chapel, and, kneeling down very humbly before our dear Lady, placed the garland upon her image, in the hope that, as she was the fairest of all flowers, and the bliss of summer to his heart, she would not disdain to accept these first flowers from her servitor. Once upon a time, when he had thus crowned the all-lovely one, it seemed to him in a vision that heaven was opened, and he saw the bright angels ascending and descending in shining garments. He heard likewise in the court of heaven the blissful attendants singing the loveliest song which was ever heard. But chiefly they sang a song about our dear Lady, which rang so sweetly that his soul melted within him from excess of rapture, and it was like what is sung of her in the sequence on All Saints' Day, that the pure Queen soars high above all the heavenly host in honor and dignity. He too began to sing with the heavenly company, and it left behind in his soul a great savor of heaven and longing after God. Once, in the beginning of May, he had, according to his custom, placed with great devotion a garland of roses upon his loveliest heaven lady, and that morning early, as he had come from a distance and was tired, he intended to allow himself a longer sleep, and omit his usual greeting to the Virgin at the proper hour. Now when the time had come for him to greet her, as he was wont to do, and he should have got up, it seemed to him as if he were in the midst of a heavenly choir, and that they were singing the Magnificat in praise of God's mother. When it was ended, the Virgin came forward and bade the brother begin the verse, O vernalis rosula, etc., which signifies, O thou lovely little rose of summer. He thought within himself that she could mean by this, and yet, wishing to obey her, he began in a joyous mood, O vernalis rosula. Whereupon immediately 3 or 4 youths of heavenly company, who were standing there in the choir, began to sing with him, and the rest of the choir took up the strain, as if in rivalry. They sang so merrily that the sound rang out as sweetly as if all stringed instruments were resounding there together. But his mortal frame could not bear the excess of melody, and he came to himself again. On the day after Our Lady's Feast of the Assumption, he was once more shown a vision of great joy in the court of heaven, but no one was allowed to enter in who was not worthy to be present there. Now when the servitor was very anxious to press in, there came a youth who caught him by the hand, saying, It is not for thee to enter in at present. Thou hast done wrong, and must expiate thy misdeed before thou wilt be allowed to hear the song of heaven. Then he led him by a crooked path into an underground hole, which was dark and desolate and very miserable to look at. The servitor could not move in it either to one side or the other, but he lay there like a man in a dungeon, who cannot see either the sun or the moon. This was a sore suffering to him, and he began to bemoan and lament himself on account of his imprisonment. Soon afterwards the youth came back, and asked him how it fared with him. The servitor answered, Very ill. Then the youth said to him, Know that the sovereign Queen of Heaven is angry with thee on account of the fault for which thou art lying here in prison. The servitor was greatly terrified at this, and said, Woe is me! Utterly miserable that I am! What have I done to her? He answered, She is angry with thee for being so unwilling to preach about her on the festivals, because yesterday on her great festival thou didst refuse thy superior's request, saying that thou wouldst not preach about her. The servitor made an answer, Alas, my friend and master! It seems to me, in truth, that she is worthy of far greater honor than that which I can give her, and that I am of too little account to undertake this office. Therefore I yield it up to those who are old and worthy, for methinks they can preach one more worthily about her than I, poor man, can. To this the youth replied, Know that it pleases her to receive this honor from thee, and it is an acceptable service from thee in her eyes. Therefore refuse no more. The servitor began to weep, and said to the youth, Ah, dearest youth, I make my peace with the pure mother, for I promise thee by my troth that it shall not happen again. The youth smiled and consoled him lovingly, and led him home out of prison, saying, I have observed from the kindly way in which the Queen of Heaven looked at it and spoke to thee, that she will lay aside her anger against thee, and will always love thee with a mother's faithful love. It was the servitor's practice when he left his cell, or returned to it, to pass through the choir before the sacrament, for he thought within himself that he who was very dear friend anywhere upon this road is very glad to make his journey a little longer in order to hold some loving converse with him. A man once asked God to bestow upon him a heavenly carnival, as he did not wish for an earthly one from the creatures, and while his senses were stilled in ecstasy, it seemed to him as if the dear Christ came in, under the form which he wore when he was 30 years of age, and signified to him that he would grant him his request, and make for him a heavenly carnival. Then he took up a cup of wine in his hand, and presented it to 3 men, who were sitting there at table, one after the other. The first sank down powerless, the second also became a little faint, but the third was not affected by it. Upon this the Lord explained to him the difference between a beginner, a proficient, and a perfect man, how unlike they are in the way which they bear themselves in spiritual sweetness. When the servitor had finished conversing with his spiritual daughter about these and such like divine endearments, she wrote it all down secretly, and then placed it in a box which she locked up for concealment and security. Now one day there came to her a good sister, whom she had given the box in charge, saying, "Dear sister, what is this marvelous heavenly secret which thou hast in thy box? I dreamed this night that there was in thy box a young heavenly boy, and that he had a sweet-stringed instrument in his hands, which he drew such ravishing spiritual melodies, that it filled many a one with spiritual delight. I pray thee to bring forth to us that what thou hast locked up, and we may read it too." But she kept silent, and would not speak to her about it, for it had been forbidden for her. Chapter 39. How he drew light-minded persons to God, and comforted those who were in suffering. The servitor had once been a long time without sending any message to his spiritual daughter. Upon this she wrote a letter to him, telling him that she was in great need of a message from him to cheer her suffering heart, and adding, "The poor find a little consolation when they see those who are poorer than themselves, and sufferers draw a little courage from hearing that some among their neighbors have been in greater straits than they are, and have helped them out of them by God." The servitor wrote thus to her in answer: "In order that thou mayest be more patient in thy sufferings, I will tell thee, for God's glory, something about suffering. I know a man on whom God's appointment there fell cruel sufferings in regards to his good name in this world. This man unceasing desire was to love God from the very bottom of his heart, and to win all persons to the same love as God, and to withdraw from them from all vain affections. And he brought this about in the case of many, both men and women. Since, however, by doing this he estranged from the devil those who had been his, and brought them back to God, the evil spirit took it ill, and appeared to be certain holy persons, and threatened that he would avenge himself on the servitor. It happened that once the servitor came to a monastery belonging to a certain order, in which the religious men are accustomed to have a special dwelling place for themselves, and the religious women of the order likewise a special dwelling place for themselves. Now in this monastery there were 2 religions, a man and a woman, who were bound to each other by closest ties of great affection and hurtful intimacy. The devil had so disguised it to their blinded hearts that they looked upon the misdeed as if it were no fault or sin, but a thing permitted to them by God. When the servitor was privately asked whether they could go on in this way without being in opposition to God's will, he answered, "No, by no means," and he told them that their view of the matter was false, contrary to Christian doctrine, and he succeeded in making them leave off their intimacy and live thenceforward in purity. While he was occupied about this matter, a holy person named Anna was rapt in spirit when she was at prayer, and she saw a great band of devils gathered together in the air above the servitor, and they all cried aloud with one voice, "Death, death to the wicked monk!" And they reviled and cursed him for having driven them forth by his good counsels from that place which was so pleasant to them. And they all swore with horrible gestures that they would never let him alone until they had revenged themselves upon him, and that if they were not allowed to touch him in his person or his goods, that they would at least inflict cruel injury upon his good name and honor in men's eyes, by laying shameful things to his charge, and however carefully he might avoid giving any cause for it, they would by falsehood and cunning bring it about. The holy woman, Anna, was greatly terrified at this, and she sought Our Dear Lady to come and help him in his impending straits. Upon which the kind mother said to her lovingly, "They can do nothing to him without my child's ordinance. What he ordains concerning him will be the best and most profitable for him. Bid him, therefore, be of good cheer." When she told this to the brother, he began to feel great alarm at the hostile assembling of the evil spirits, and, as he often used to do in his distresses, ascend the hill on which a chapel stands dedicated to the holy angels, and he went 9 times round the temple, according to his custom, saying prayers in honor of the 9 choirs of the heavenly host, and he besought them earnestly to be his helpers against all his enemies. Early that same morning he was earned in a spiritual vision to a beautiful plain, and he saw there all around him an exceedingly great company of angels, who stood ready to help him, and they comforted him, saying, "God is with thee, and will never leave thee in any of thy straits." Cease not, then, to draw worldly hearts to the love of God. This confirmed him in his purpose, and he busied himself all the more diligently in bringing back both the wild and the tame to God. He had succeeded by his good words in coming round a ferocious man who had been 18 years without confession. This man was inspired by God with confidence in the servitor, and confessed to him with such great contrition that they both began to weep. He died soon afterwards, and made a happy end. He once converted 12 sinful women from their evil life. It is impossible to tell how much he suffered from them. In the end, however, only 2 of them persevered. There were at that time up and down the country many persons of the female sex, both secular and religious, who from the frailty of their disposition had fallen openly into sinful practices. These poor women, through shame, dared not confess to any of their heart's anguish, so that from agony and distress of mind they were often assailed by the temptation to destroy themselves. Now when these persons heard that the servitor had a tender heart for all who were suffering, they took courage and came to him, each one at the time when her distress lay heavy upon her, and disclosed to him their anguish and the straits in which they were held captive. When he saw these poor hearts in such misery and suffering, he used to weep with them and console them lovingly. He often risked his good name in this world in order to keep them to recover their souls and their reputation. He let malicious tongues pass what judgment on him they pleased. Among others, there was a lady of high birth, whose contrition for her fall was very great. One day Our Lady appeared to her and said, "Go to my chaplain. He will set thee right again." She answered, "Alas, lady, I know him not." The Mother of Compassion replied, "Look here beneath my mantle, where I keep him under my guard, and note well his face, that thou mayest know him again. He is a help in need and a comforter of all who suffer. He will comfort thee." The lady came to the servitor from a foreign land, and she recognized his face as she had seen it before in spirit, and she prayed him to bring her back to grace, and told him what had befallen her. He received her very kindly, and set right again the best of his ability, according as the Mother of Compassion had enjoined him. Chapter 40. Of a grievous suffering which befell him while thus occupied. Such was the way in which the servitor aided many persons who were in suffering. But the good work cost him dear, owing to the martyrdom of suffering which fell upon him in consequence. And God showed him these afflictions, when they were still future, in the following vision. Once when he was traveling, he arrived one evening at an inn, and just before daybreak it seemed to him in a vision that he was taken to a place where Mass was going to be sung, and he had to sing it, for the lot had fallen upon him. The singer began the Mass of Martyrs. That is, many are the sufferings of God's friends. He was not pleased at hearing this, and would have been very glad to change it, saying, "How strange! Why are you deafening us with the martyrs? Why do you sing to the day the Mass of Martyrs? Are we not keeping any martyrs' feast today?" They looked at him and pointed at him with their fingers, saying, "God has many martyrs now at this time, as he ever had. Get ready then, and sing for thyself." He turned over the pages of the Missal which lay before him, and would much rather have sung the Mass of Confessors, or any other one except for that of the suffering martyrs. But though he turned the book over and over again, it was full of masses of martyrs. When he saw that it could not be otherwise, he sang with them, and his singing rang forth exceedingly mournfully. After a little while he began again, and said to them, "This is very singular. One would much rather sing Gaudeamus, let us rejoice, about joyful things, than sing as we are doing about sorrowful things." They answered, "Good friend, thou dost not understand it yet. This song about the martyrs go first, and then when the proper time has come, the joyous song Gaudeamus follows after it." When he came to himself, again his heart trembled within him because of the vision, and he said, "Alas, O God, must I once more suffer martyrdom?" In consequence of this, his demeanor became so sorrowful as he journeyed onwards, that his companion asked him, saying, "Ah, Father, what is the matter with you, that you look so exceedingly sorrowful?" He answered, "Alas, dear companion, I have to sing here the Mass of Martyrs," meaning that God has made known to him that he had a martyrdom to suffer. But his companion understood him not, so he remained silent and kept it all within himself. On his arrival to the town, which took place in the dark days before Christmas, he was, as usual, so sorely visited with bitter sufferings that it seemed to him, as the saying is, that his heart within his body must break, if such a thing ever happened to those in sorrow. For these sufferings hedged him around on all sides, and it was his sad lot not to have everything taken from him which had been a support to him in the way of service and consolation, or honor which was of a nature calculated to comfort a man here below. This bitter suffering was of the following kind. Amongst those persons whom he had tried to lead to God, there came to him a deceitful, crafty woman, who, under an outward good life, concealed a wolfish heart, which she hid so well that the brother for a long time did not perceive it. She had before this fallen into great sin with a man, and had added to her crime by attributing the offspring to a different person from the guilty man, who protested his own innocence in the matter. The servitor did not reject the woman on account of her misdeeds, but he heard her confession, and helped her in all needful and proper ways, more than it was the custom of the other religious of the country, who were called terminarer mendicants, to do. After he had gone for a long time, it came to the knowledge of the servitor and of other reliable persons that she was still secretly continuing the same evil practices as before. He said nothing about it, and would have gladly avoided it making it known. At the same time he gave up his relations with her and ceased to help her. When the woman became aware of this, she sent him word not to act thus, and threatened him that, if he left off giving her the same assistance as before, he would suffer for it, for that she would father upon him a child, which she had by a secular man, and would thus be put to shame by means of the child, and be covered with infamy everywhere. The servitor was filled with consternation at these words, and stood motionless. Then, sighing inwardly, he thus spoke within himself: "Anguish and distress surround me on all sides, and I know not which way to turn. For if I act in this way, woe is me, and if I do not act thus, still woe is me. And I am so girt round on all sides by distress and woe, that I am like to sink under it." And thus, with terror in his heart, he waited for whatever God might allow the devil to bring upon him. At last, after taking counsel with God and himself, he came to the conclusion that these two miserable alternatives was better for him in soul and body: to abandon the wicked woman altogether, let the consequence to his good name be what they might. And so he did. This inflamed her fierce heart with such rage against him that, running hither and thither to ecclesiastics and seculars, she strove with more than human weakness to defame herself in order to bring suffering upon the poor man, and she told everyone that she had had a child, and it was by the brother. All who believed her words were greatly scandalized at it, and the scandal was greater the wider the reputation of his holiness had spread. All this pierced him through to his inmost heart and soul, and, being thus encompassed on every side by anguish and distress, he lived absorbed in himself, and the days seemed to him long and the nights miserable, and his short sleep was mingled with panic frights. He used to look upon sorrowfully to God, and with deep groans exclaimed, "Alas, O God, my hour of woe is come. How shall I, or how can I, bear this agony of heart? Alas, O God, would that I had died before I ever saw or heard of this misery. Lord, behold, I have honored thy venerable name all the days of my life, and I have taught many persons far and wide to love and honor it. And wilt thou bring my name such great dishonor? This was a sore thing that I complain of. Behold, how the venerable order of preachers must now be brought to disgrace through me. I grieve for this, and shall always grieve for it. Woe is me, by reason of the straits into which my heart has come. All good persons, who before held me in great honor as a holy man, a thing which gave me courage to persevere, now, alas, regard me as a wicked deceiver of the world, and this pierces and wounds my heart through and through." When the poor sufferer had spent much time in these lamentations, and his body and vital powers were wasting away, there came to him a woman, saying, "Good sir, why do you wear yourself away through the excess of grief? Be of good cheer. I will give you such counsel and assistance that, if you will follow my advice, your good name will remain uninjured. Therefore take courage." He looked up and said to her, "Dear lady, how will you bring this to pass?" She answered, "I will take away the child by stealth under the cloak, and either bury it alive at night or stick a needle into its brain so that it will die." Thus the vile slander will fall to the ground, and you will keep your good name." He answered in a voice of fury, "Woe is me, wicked murderess! Alas for thy murderous heart! Wouldst thou thus kill a guiltless babe? What matter that its mother is a wicked woman? Wouldst thou bury it alive? No, no, God forbid such a crime would ever be committed through me. See, the very worst that can befall me in this matter is the loss of my worldly honor. But if the worldly honor of a whole country depended upon me, I would rather sacrifice it today to the everlasting glorious God than let this innocent blood thus perish." She replied, "And yet it is not your child. Then why trouble yourself about it?" Upon which she drew forth a sharp-pointed knife and said, "Let me take it away out of your sight, and I will wring its neck or stick this knife into its little heart. It will be dead at once, and you will be at peace again." He answered, "Silence, thou unclean and wicked devil. Be it whose child it may be on earth, it is still formed after God's image, has been fully dearly purchased with the precious and innocent blood of Christ. Therefore I will not that its young blood be shed in this way." The woman made answer to him impatiently, "If you will not let it be killed, at least let me carry it secretly into the church some morning, that it may fare with it as with other deserted foundlings. Else you will be put to greater expense and annoyance until the child's bringing it up is finished." He replied, "I trust in the rich God of heaven, who has always provided for me hitherto, that he will provide henceforth for both of us." Then he added, "Go and bring me the babe very secretly, that I may see it." When he took the babe into his bosom and looked at it, the baby smiled at him. Upon which, fetching a deep sigh, he said, "I should then kill a pretty babe that smiles at me? No, in truth. I will gladly suffer whatever may befall me through it." And then turning to the babe, he said, "Alas, thou helpless, tender babe! Thou art indeed a poor orphan, for thy own false father was denied thee, and thy murderous mother has sought to fling thee away, like an ugly good-for-nothing whelp. Well, since God's providence has given it to me in such a way that I cannot help being thy father, I will gladly act as one towards thee, and I will receive thee from God and from no one else. Even as he is dear to me, so shalt thou too be dear to me as my own sweet babe. Ah, child of my heart, thou sittest in my sorrowful lap, and lookest up at me so lovingly, and yet canst not speak. Alas, and I too look at thee with wounded heart and tearful eyes, and mouth that kisses thee, and bedew thy infant face with the stream of my hot tears." When the pretty boy felt the great tears of the weeping man fall so fast upon his little eyes, he too began to weep heartily with him, and they both wept together. But when the servitor saw the babe thus weeping, he pressed it tenderly to his heart, and said, "Be still, my darling. Alas, child of my heart, should I kill thee because thou art not my child, but must cost me dear? Alas, my beautiful, dear, tender child, I would not hurt thee, for thou must be my child and God's child. And so long as God provides me with one single mouthful, I will share it with thee, and to the glory of the good God, and I will bear patiently whatever may befall me through thee, my own sweet child." When the cruel-hearted woman who had before wished to kill the babe heard him speak thus tenderly amid his tears, she was so deeply moved by it to great pity, and broke out into such loud cries and weeping, that he was obliged to quiet her, lest someone should come and the whole thing be known. At length, when she had wept her full, he gave her back the babe, and blessed it, saying, May the loving God bless thee, and the holy angels guard thee from all evil. And he bade her provide it with what was needful at his cost. Afterwards the wicked woman, the child's mother, set to work again. As she had already greatly slandered her brother, so she continued to do whenever she had an opportunity of injuring him, on which account he became an object of pity to many pure and virtuous souls, and they often wished that the just God would take her away out of this world. It happened once that the servitor's kinsman came to him and said, Alas, sir, for the great crime which this woman has committed against you. God knows I will avenge you on her. I will secretly station myself on the long bridge which goes over the water, and when the sacrilegious wretch passes that way, I will throw her over and drown her, and her great crime shall be avenged upon her. He answered, No, my friend. God forbid that any living being should be put to death on my account. God, who knows all hidden things, knows that she had done me wrong about the child. Therefore I leave the matter in his hand, either to slay her or let her live according to his will. And I will tell thee that, even if I were willing to disregard my soul by conniving at her death, I would still honor her the dignity of all pure women, allow her the benefit of it. The man answered very angrily, As for me, I would soon kill a woman as a man, if she had behaved to me so villainously. He replied, Nay, for that would be an act of most unreasonable and blameworthy ferocity. Think no more about it, and let all the suffering fall upon me which God wills me to suffer. As the servitor's afflictions were continually on the increase, it seemed to him one day, through the infirmity of his soul, that his distress had reached such a point that he must needs go forth in quest of something to support and cheer him in his sufferings. Accordingly, he went out to seek for consolation, and he hoped to meet with it, especially in the hands of the two of his friends, who while he was sat still at the upper side of the fortune's wheel, had treated him as though they were his true friends and comrades. He was from them that he now sought consolation for his suffering heart. Alas, God showed in him both that no dependence is to be placed in creatures, for he was more cruelly humiliated by them and those about them than he was ever by ordinary people. One of these friends received the afflicted brother very harshly, and turning away his face from him in anger, behaved to him in a very insulting manner, with cutting words. Among other offensive expressions which he used, he told the servitor to cease in future from all familiarity with him, for that he was ashamed of his company. Alas, this pierced the servitor's inmost heart, and he answered mournfully, O dear friend, if by God's ordinance thou hast fallen into the miry pool, as I have done, verily I would have sprung in thee after thee, and lovingly helped thee out of it. O misery, is it not enough for thee to see me lying before thee deep in the mire? But thou must needs trample on me besides. Of this I make my plaint to the sorrowful heart of Jesus Christ. His friend bade me be silent, and said to him insultingly, There is an end of you now. Not only your preaching, but your books, to which you have written, ought to be treated with contempt. The servitor answered him very sweetly, and looking up to heaven said, I put my trust in the good God of heaven that my books will still be more valued, and they have ever been, when the appointed time shall come. Such was the mournful consolation which he received from his best friends. Hitherto in this town his necessities have been fully supplied by kind-hearted persons, but when these lying and slanderous tales were carried to them, those who believed the false tale-mongers withdrew from him their help and friendship, until at length, the truth having been manifested to them by God, they returned to him and acknowledged that he was guiltless. One day, when he had sat down to take a little rest, his bodily senses were stilled in ecstasy, and it seemed to him that he was carried into a land above the ken of sense. Then he heard something say in the very depths of his soul, "Hearken, hearken to a word of consolation, which I will read to thee." He did as bidden, and listened attentively, upon which the voice began to read in Latin the following words from that chapter of the Vigil of Christmas: "Non vocaburis ultra derelicta, etc." Isaiah 42:4. That is, "Thou shalt no more be called the forsaken of God, and thy land shall not be called the waste land. Thy name shall be, God's will is in thee, and thy land shall be cultivated. For the heavenly Father is well pleased with thee." When the voice had finished reading these words, it began to read the same words over and over again, full 4 times. The servitor in astonishment said, "Dear friend, what meanest thou by repeating these words so often?" The voice answered, "I do this to strengthen thy confidence in God, who will provide for the land of his friends, that is, for their mortal bodies, all things needful to them, and when they require is withdrawn from them on one side, he will make it up to them on another. In this fatherly way, the Almighty and everlasting God will deal with thee." And in truth, all this came to pass so manifestly that many a heart laughed for joy at it, and the Almighty and everlasting God was praised by those who had shed many tears before. God was praised by those who had before shed many tears from great compassion. It fared with the suffering man as with some dead animal which had been knocked about and torn in pieces by wild beast, and yet had some marrow left in it. Last of all, the hungry flies and other insects settle upon it, and strip bare the gnawed bones, and carry away with them in the air the marrow which they have sucked out. Even so the servitor was miserably pulled to pieces, and his shame was carried far and wide into distant lands by persons of seeming piety. And they did this with good words and under the cover of regrets, and with outward show of friendship, which was nothing but faithfulness within. In consequence of this, evil thoughts like these would sometimes dart across the servitor's mind. Alas, dear God, he who only suffers at the hands of Jews and heathen and open sinners may contrive to bear it. But these persons who are tormenting me so grievously have the appearance of being thy good friends, and therefore it is much more painful. But when he came to himself and took a reasonable view of it, he excused them from all fault and acknowledged that it was God who had done it through them, and that it was fitting that he should suffer thus, and that Almighty God often orders things for his friends' good by means of his enemies. Once, especially, when he was suffering from these thoughts, it was said to him interiorly, "Remember that Christ the Lord would not have his beloved disciple John and his faithful St. Peter in his pure company, but he willed also to endure the wicked Judas at his side. And dost thou desire to imitate Christ, and yet will not endure thy Judas. A thought in answer flashed at once across his mind. Alas, Lord, if a suffering friend of God had only one Judas, it would be bearable. But in these times every corner is full of Judases, and when one departs, 4 or 5 spring up. To this there came the following reply within him. A man who is what he ought to be should not look on any Judases as a Judas, but he should regard him as God's fellow worker, by whom he is trained and purified for his good. When Judas betrayed Christ with a kiss, Christ called him friend, saying, My friend, wherefore art thou come? The sufferings of this poor man had now lasted a long time, and there was one very ground for comfort to which he clung, and to which was all his support, namely, that the burden which weighed him down had not been brought before judges and prelates of the order. This little comfort was speedily withdrawn from him by God, for the Master General of the whole order and the Master of the German province came together to the town which the wicked woman had slandered the pious servitor of God. When the poor man, who was living in another place, had heard this news, his heart died within him utterly, and he said to himself, If perchance the masters gave credence to the wicked woman against thee, thou art dead, for they will condemn thee to such a penitential prison that it were better for thee to die. He remained under the weight of his anguish 12 days and nights continuously, and during this time he was in constant expectation of this agonizing penance, as soon as they should arrive there. One day, overcome by the state of misery in which he was, he broke out, through the human frailty, into unseemly gestures, and every one into a place of secrecy, where none could hear or see him. He gave way at intervals to deep and repeated groans. The tears stood in his eyes and then streamed down his cheeks. His distress was so intense that he could not remain still, but he would sit down on a sudden, and then spring up again and run down the room like a man wrestling with grief and anguish. And there shot through his heart the thought which took the form of a remonstrance, thus, Alas, O everlasting God, what is thy purpose with me? Meanwhile, when he was in this sad disordered state, a voice from God spoke within him, saying, Where is now thy detachment, that evenness of soul and weal and woe, which thou hast so often and so joyously counseled to others, while thou didst lovingly point out to them how entirely a man should abandon himself to God, and hold fast by nothing? To this he answered with many tears, Asketh thou me where my detachment is? Rather, do thou tell me where God's unfathomable pity for his friends. For in spite of it, I am waiting here in utter desolation, like a man condemned to forfeit his life, property, and honor. I had fancied that God was kind. I had fancied that there was a good and gracious Lord to all who ventured to abandon themselves to him. Woe is me! God has failed me. Alas, that vein of kindness whose compassionate streams never yet ran dry, has run dry for me, poor man. Alas, the kind heart whose kindness the whole world proclaims has deserted me, poor man, miserably, and he has turned away from me his beautiful eyes, his gracious countenance. O thou divine countenance, thou kind heart, I had never deemed of thee that thou wouldst have cast me off so utterly. O fathomless abyss, come to my aid, for I am altogether undone. Thou knowest that my consolation and reliance is in thee alone, and in no one else on earth. O hearken to me this day, for God's sake, all ye suffering hearts. See that no one take scandal at my disordered state. For long as detachment was in my mouth, it was sweet for me to speak of it. But now my whole heart is wounded through and through, and the inmost core of all my veins and brains is transpierced with anguish, and there is not a limb of my body which is not tortured and wounded in every part of it. How then can I be attached? Then he had spent about a half a day in this disordered state, and his brain was quite shattered. As he sat still at last and returned from him to God, gave himself up to God's will with these words, May it not be otherwise. Fiat voluntas tua, thy will be done. As he sat thus, with his sense wrapped in ecstasy, he seemed to him in a vision that there came and stood before him one of his holy spiritual daughters, who, when was yet alive, had often told him he would have many sufferings, and that everlasting God would help him out of them. She now appeared to him and lovingly tried to comfort him, but he received her consolations angrily and charged her with untruthfulness. She smiled at this, and drawing nearer, offered him her holy hand, saying, Accept my Christian troth in God's stead, that he will not forsake you, but will help you to come out victorious from these and all other sufferings. He answered, See, daughter, the weight of my afflictions is so great that I can no longer credit thee, unless thou givest me some token that thy words are true. She replied, God himself will manifest your innocence to all good and pure hearts. As for wicked hearts, things look to them according to the color of their own wickedness. A wise friend of God needs them not. Moreover, the order of preachers which you bewail shall be more pleasing to God and all reasonable men on your account. And as a sign that these words are true, note this: the everlasting God will soon avenge you, and will let fall his wrathful hand upon the wicked heart which has thus troubled you. Moreover, all those who have specially abetted her by their malicious slandering shall soon feel his vengeance. Be sure of this. The brother was much comforted by these words, and waited steadfastly in expectation of how God would bring this matter to an end. Very soon after, it came to pass exactly as she had said. For the monster who had thus tormented him died, and she died by too sudden a death, and many others also among the chief causes of his suffering were snatched hence by death, some of them dying insensible, and others without confession and communion. One of these persons, who had been a prelate, and had caused great suffering to the servitor, appeared to him in a vision after death, and told him was on this account God had cut short his life and term of office, adding that he would have to waste and wither in purgatory for a long time as penance for it. Many persons who knew what had happened and were favorably disposed towards the servitor, on seeing this unusual vengeance and the deaths which God sent so suddenly upon his adversaries, praised Almighty God, saying, Of a truth God is with this good man, and we shall well see that wrong has been done to him. But it is just that he should henceforth be of more account to the eyes of reasonable men, and look upon as higher in holiness than if God had not visited him with these sufferings. Moreover, the prelate of the German province exculpated him, saying that he and the Master General of the order had held a strict visitation about him, as was befitting, and had found nothing against him, save that a wicked woman, who was unworthy to be believed, had spoken maliciously of the honest man, a thing which might very well happen, if people would give ear to their wicked tongues. Thus the kind God succored the servitor, and very graciously caused this terrible storm of suffering to subside and pass away, according as the holy daughter in the vision had told him for his consolation. And he often thought within himself, Ah, Lord, how true the words are which thou said of thee, he to whom God wishes well can be harmed by no one. The friend, also, who had behaved to him in such an unfriendly way, was shortly afterwards taken hence by God. After his death, when all hindrances which had delayed him from beholding God face to face had been removed, he appeared to the servitor in golden garments radiant with light, embracing him lovingly, pressing his face tenderly against his cheeks, and besought his pardon for all the wrong he had done him, and prayed him that a true heavenly friendship might continue between them everlastingly. The servitor accepted this proposal with joy, and embraced him in turn very lovingly, upon which he vanished out of sight, and entered again into the bliss of God. Afterwards, when the appointed time had come, God gladdened the sufferer in return for all his sufferings with inward peace of heart, still repose, and bright illuminations of grace, so that he praised God with all his heart for the past suffering, saying that he would not take the whole world not to have suffered it. But moreover, it was given to him to see clearly that this crushing blow had been in a more noble fashion drawn out of him and transported into God than by all the manifold sufferings which had endured from his youth upwards.